June 14, 1945. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor of Building C at the temporary processing facility outside Naha, Okinawa. 23-year-old Yuki Tanaka, her once pristine white nursing uniform now stained with months of cave dust and dried blood, sat rigid on the edge of a metal cot, her hands folded precisely in her lap as she had been taught since childhood. The American medical orderly had told her that dinner would be served in the main hall at 1700 hours, but she could not comprehend what he meant by main hall. In her world, meals were private affairs, carefully segregated by rank, age, and above all, by gender. The sound of boots, echoing in the corridor outside her temporary quarters, made her stomach clench with familiar dread. For 3 months in the limestone caves of southern Okinawa, such sounds had meant incoming artillery, wounded soldiers, or orders to evacuate to yet another underground sanctuary. But these footsteps carried a different rhythm, unhurried, purposeful, accompanied by voices speaking in the enemy language she had been taught to fear. When the door opened, she expected to see interrogators, perhaps torturers preparing to extract military secrets through pain and humiliation. Instead, a young American woman in a clean medical uniform entered, carrying a clipboard and speaking in careful, broken Japanese phrases that Yuki had learned from her high school textbooks before the war consumed everything familiar about her world. "Tanaka-san, dinner time. Please come with me." The very notion that this foreign woman would address her with respectful honorifics, that she would speak her language with such evident effort, violated everything Yuki had been taught about American barbarism and cultural superiority of the Japanese Empire. As they walked through corridors lined with other Japanese prisoners, some she recognized from the Himuri Student Corps, others bearing the uniforms of various medical units, Yuki began to detect an aroma that seemed impossible under the circumstances. The rich, complex sense of properly cooked food, not the watery rice gruel and pickled radish that had sustained her for months, but actual meat, fresh vegetables, and bread that smelled like it had been baked that very day. Her mouth watered involuntarily, and shame flooded through her chest. How could her body betray her principles so readily, responding with hunger to enemy food that might be poisoned, drugged, or simply designed to corrupt her loyalty to the emperor? The double doors to the main hall opened, and Yuki Tanaka stopped walking entirely, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. Long wooden tables filled the space, surrounded by chairs where men and women sat together, eating from the same plates, drinking from identical cups, engaged in casual conversation that crossed gender lines with an ease that seemed profoundly unnatural to her rigidly structured understanding of proper social behavior. American soldiers, men who should have been weak with starvation according to every radio broadcast she had heard, sat beside Japanese women prisoners, offering them bread, pointing to different dishes, attempting conversation through gestures and broken phrases in both languages. Most shocking of all, American women, nurses, clerks, and other military personnel, sat at the same tables as their male colleagues, laughing at shared jokes, participating in discussions about medical procedures and administrative matters with a casual equality that challenged every assumption Yuki had absorbed about the natural order of civilized society. In the traditional Japan that had shaped her worldview, meals were solemn affairs governed by precise hierarchies. Men ate first, served by women who knelt silently beside them, refilling rice bowls and teacups without being asked. Women ate separately, often in the kitchen or in designated areas away from male company, their conversations restricted to domestic matters and whispered gossip about neighborhood affairs. Even in the military medical units where she had served, male doctors and orderlies ate at different times than female nurses and medical students, maintaining the proper social boundaries that distinguished civilized Japanese society from the chaotic individualism of Western barbarians. But here, in this American facility, those boundaries had dissolved completely. She watched in fascination and horror as a young American nurse, perhaps her own age, reached across the table to help herself to vegetables from a serving dish, her bare arm passing directly in front of a male sergeant who simply moved his coffee cup slightly to give her more room. No bowing, no apologies for the intrusion, no acknowledgement that she had violated fundamental principles of proper feminine behavior. The casual intimacy of the gesture, so devoid of the careful formality that governed even the simplest interactions between men and women in Japanese society, struck Yuki as both liberating and deeply threatening. An elderly American doctor with gray hair and kind eyes approached her as she stood frozen in the doorway, speaking in accented but surprisingly fluent Japanese that suggested years of study and practice. "Tanaka-san, please sit wherever you are comfortable. There is plenty of food for everyone, and you are welcome at any table." The very concept of choosing where to sit, of making such a decision based on personal comfort rather than social protocol, seemed as foreign to her as the language she was hearing. She finally selected a chair at the end of a table occupied primarily by other Japanese prisoners, reasoning that this would minimize her exposure to the disturbing spectacle of mixed-gender dining while still allowing her to observe this unprecedented social experiment. The American medical orderly who had escorted her to the hall placed a metal tray before her, laden with foods that she recognized intellectually but had not seen in their proper form for years. The rice was white and perfectly cooked, each grain distinct and flavorful, not the brownish gruel mixed with barley and wheat husks that had become standard throughout the Japanese Empire as food supplies dwindled. The vegetables were crisp and colorful, carrots that were actually orange rather than the yellowed, half-rotten specimens that reached the caves through sporadic supply drops, cabbage that was fresh and green rather than wilted and bitter, potatoes that had been peeled and cooked with care rather than thrown whole into a pot with their skins still caked with dirt. There was meat on her plate, actual beef that appeared to have come from healthy cattle rather than the gristly scraps occasionally available to medical personnel during the final months of the Okinawa campaign. The bread was soft and white, made from genuine wheat flour rather than the mixture of sawdust, acorn meal, and rice hulls that Japanese military bakers had been forced to use as ingredients became scarce. Butter, real butter, not the gray, rancid substitute that had characterized Japanese institutional meals, sat in small portions beside each slice. But it was not merely the abundance that shocked her. It was the casual way this feast was being consumed, with men and women sitting side by side, sharing dishes, passing condiments without elaborate ceremonial exchanges, engaging in conversations that ranged from professional medical discussions to personal anecdotes about life in America before the war. She watched as a young American lieutenant helped an elderly Japanese nurse understand how to use a fork, demonstrating the proper technique with gentle patience rather than the brusque authority she had expected from enemy soldiers. At the table beside her, she observed something that challenged her understanding of masculine and feminine roles even more profoundly. An American male nurse, the very concept seemed contradictory to her rigid conception of gendered professions, was explaining injection techniques to a group that included both men and women, Japanese and American personnel. His expertise was acknowledged by everyone present, regardless of gender or nationality, and several of the women asked technical questions that he answered with the same serious attention he gave to male colleagues. Yuki began to eat slowly, each bite bringing flavors that seemed almost impossibly rich after months of subsistence on whatever could be foraged or obtained through increasingly disrupted supply chains. The meat was tender and properly seasoned, the vegetables retained their natural flavors rather than the bitter, overcooked mushiness that had characterized cave cooking, and the bread had a sweetness that spoke of adequate sugar and proper baking techniques. As she ate, she found herself eavesdropping on conversations taking place around her, gradually comprehending fragments of English mixed with broken Japanese as Americans and Japanese prisoners attempted to communicate across linguistic barriers. What she heard challenged every piece of propaganda she had internalized about American society and values. The American personnel spoke of home with obvious affection, describing families and communities that seemed stable and prosperous rather than the chaotic, crime-ridden wasteland depicted in Japanese media. They mentioned relatives serving in Europe, expressing concern for their safety but also confidence in American industrial capacity to support military operations on multiple continents simultaneously. Most significantly, they discussed their Japanese prisoners with genuine respect and curiosity, asking questions about Japanese culture and customs that suggested intellectual engagement rather than the contempt she had been taught to expect from racial enemies. One conversation particularly captured her attention. A young American female doctor was explaining to a Japanese nurse how American hospitals were organized, describing medical schools where women and men studied together, surgical teams that included personnel of both genders working in close cooperation, and research programs where discoveries were shared openly rather than being restricted by military secrecy or social hierarchies. The Japanese nurse asked hesitant questions about American medical training, wondering aloud how women could concentrate on their studies when working alongside men, how they maintained proper modesty while examining patients of the opposite gender, how they balanced professional responsibilities with family obligations. The American doctor answered each question with patient detail, describing a society where gender roles were more flexible, where individual capability mattered more than traditional social expectations, where women could pursue careers while still maintaining personal relationships. Yuki found herself leaning forward to catch every word of this exchange, her mind racing to process implications that threatened to overturn her entire understanding of civilized society. If women could be doctors in America, if they could work alongside men without losing their feminine virtue, if they could contribute to professional discussions without undermining male authority, then perhaps everything she had been taught about the natural order of gender relations was not natural at all, but merely one possible arrangement among many. The realization struck her with physical force, causing her to set down her fork and stare at her plate while waves of disorientation washed over her consciousness. She had devoted her life to serving the emperor through medical service, accepting without question that her role was to support and assist male doctors who possessed superior judgment and authority by virtue of their gender. She had never questioned why women were excluded from certain medical procedures, why they were not permitted to perform surgery independently, why their opinions carried less weight in treatment decisions even when their knowledge and experience equaled or exceeded that of their male colleagues. But here, in this American facility, she was witnessing a completely different model of professional relationships. Men and women collaborated as equals, sharing expertise and making decisions based on medical evidence rather than social hierarchy. The casual intimacy of their interactions, their obvious mutual respect, their ability to disagree professionally without personal animosity, all of this suggested that the rigid gender segregation she had accepted as natural and necessary might actually be artificial and limiting. The American doctor concluded her explanation by inviting the Japanese nurse to observe American medical procedures, offering to teach her surgical techniques that had been restricted to male doctors in Japanese medical facilities. "Your knowledge and skill are what matter," she said in her careful Japanese. "Gender should not determine what you are capable of learning or achieving in medicine." Yuki watched the Japanese nurse's face transform as she processed this invitation, seeing emotions flicker across her features that ranged from excitement to terror to something approaching hope. Here was an offer to transcend the limitations that had governed her entire professional life, to explore capabilities that had been denied to her simply because of her gender. The internal conflict was visible in her expression, the desire to learn warring with internalized beliefs about proper feminine behavior, intellectual curiosity battling against loyalty to traditional values. As the evening progressed, Yuki observed other interactions that gradually undermined her confidence in the superiority of Japanese social organization. American personnel treated their Japanese prisoners with consistent courtesy, regardless of rank or gender, offering medical care that exceeded anything available to Japanese military personnel during the final months of the war. They answered questions about American society with apparent honesty, describing both strengths and weaknesses without the propaganda flourishes that had characterized all information she had received about enemy capabilities and intentions. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that American abundance was not temporary or artificial, but represented the normal condition of their society even during wartime. The casual way Americans treated what she considered luxury items, discarding bread crusts without thought, serving generous portions without apparent concern for waste, offering seconds and thirds to anyone who requested them, suggested industrial and agricultural capabilities that dwarfed anything Japan could hope to match. When she asked a young American medic about food supplies, wondering whether this abundance was a special display designed to impress prisoners, his response shattered her remaining faith in Japanese propaganda about enemy weakness. "Oh, this is just standard military rations," he explained. "Nothing special. Back home, civilians are eating much better than this, even with rationing. Our farmers are producing more food now than before the war started, and our factories are running at full capacity." The implications of this casual statement reverberated through her consciousness like physical blows. If American military personnel considered this feast to be routine, if their civilian population was eating better than their soldiers, if their industrial capacity was actually expanding during the war rather than being exhausted by it, then every assumption about the strategic balance had been catastrophically wrong. She thought of the wounded soldiers she had treated in the caves, men who had fought with desperate courage while surviving on handfuls of rice mixed with sawdust, who had endured surgery without anesthesia because medical supplies had been exhausted months earlier, who had died not from enemy weapons but from infections that could have been prevented with adequate antiseptics and proper nutrition. She thought of the propaganda broadcasts that had sustained their morale during the darkest moments, promising that American forces were also suffering from shortages, that their supply lines were failing, that their industrial capacity was being overwhelmed by the demands of global warfare. All lies. All of it had been lies designed to maintain fighting spirit in the face of impossible odds, to prevent the kind of realistic assessment that might have led to surrender before the destruction became complete. She had contributed to spreading those lies, reassuring wounded soldiers that their sacrifice was meaningful, that victory was still possible, that the Emperor's divine blessing would ultimately triumph over American material advantages. The metal fork felt heavy in her hand as she contemplated the magnitude of the deception. How many men had died believing the lies she had helped to propagate? How many families had been destroyed by a war that was unwinnable from the beginning? How many women like herself had sacrificed their youth and health in service to leaders who had known the truth but had chosen to pursue a course that could only end in national catastrophe? The conversation around her began to fade into background noise as she struggled with these revelations. The casual laughter of Americans and Japanese sharing a meal, the sight of men and women collaborating as equals, the abundance of food that represented only routine military provisions, all of it combined to create a picture of American society that bore no resemblance to the propaganda she had internalized throughout her adult life. When the meal concluded and she was escorted back to her quarters, Yuki carried with her more than the physical satisfaction of adequate nutrition. She carried the beginning of a transformation that would fundamentally alter her understanding of gender, society, and the nature of civilized behavior. The communal table had become a window into possibilities that she had never been allowed to imagine, and the view through that window would continue to expand her awareness of what human relationships could become when freed from artificial restrictions and traditional hierarchies. In the weeks that followed, as more Japanese prisoners arrived at the facility and underwent the same shocking introduction to American dining customs, a pattern emerged that would prove decisive in shaping post-war Japanese society. Women who had been raised to accept subordination began to question why such subordination was necessary. Men who had been taught that their authority derived from gender rather than competence began to recognize the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies. And both groups began to understand that the communal table represented more than just a different way of sharing food. It represented a different way of organizing human relationships based on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy. The implications would extend far beyond individual psychology. As these prisoners were eventually repatriated to Japan, they carried with them new ideas about gender roles, social organization, and the possibilities for human cooperation that transcended traditional boundaries. The communal table had planted seeds of transformation that would grow into the democratic reforms of the American occupation, the women's rights movements of the 1950s, and the gradual evolution of Japanese society toward greater gender equality in the decades that followed. But on that June evening in 1945, Yuki Tanaka simply lay on her cot in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the fundamental challenge to everything she had believed about proper feminine behavior, social hierarchy, and the nature of civilized society. The taste of real butter still lingered on her tongue, but it was the memory of men and women eating together in casual equality that would prove to be the more lasting and transformative flavor. The transformation did not occur overnight, nor was it without internal conflict and emotional turmoil. As June melted into July, and more Japanese prisoners arrived at the facility with accounts of conditions throughout the crumbling empire, Yuki found herself caught between competing loyalties and evolving understanding. Her devotion to the emperor remained intact, but her faith in the wisdom of Japanese leadership had been severely shaken by daily exposure to evidence of their catastrophic miscalculations about American capabilities and intentions. The communal dining hall had become her laboratory for observing American social behavior, and each meal brought new revelations about the possibilities for human interaction when freed from the rigid constraints that had governed her entire life. She watched American women engage in technical discussions about medical procedures with a confidence and expertise that would have been considered unseemly in Japanese society. She observed American men listen respectfully to female colleagues, acknowledging their insights and expertise without any apparent threat to masculine authority. Most significantly, she began to participate in these interactions herself, asking questions and offering observations that would have been inappropriate for a woman in traditional Japanese settings. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Chinese-American psychiatrist who had been assigned to work with Japanese prisoners, recognized the psychological significance of these dining room interactions and began documenting their impact on prisoner attitudes and behavior. Her reports to American intelligence officers emphasized that the communal table was proving to be a more effective tool for understanding Japanese society than formal interrogation techniques, and that the information gathered during casual mealtime conversations was providing unprecedented insights into Japanese civilian morale and social conditions. The women are particularly valuable sources of intelligence, Dr. Chen wrote in one of her weekly reports. Their training in medical fields has given them detailed knowledge of conditions in Japanese hospitals, military medical units, and civilian health facilities that provides a comprehensive picture of the empire's internal deterioration. But more importantly, their exposure to American social customs is creating a psychological transformation that may prove crucial in shaping post-war Japanese society. Yuki had become one of Dr. Chen's most interesting case studies, not merely because of her medical knowledge and intelligence, but because of the visible evolution in her self-perception and worldview. The young woman who had arrived at the facility 3 weeks earlier, bowing deeply to every American she encountered and speaking only when directly questioned, had gradually become an active participant in dining room discussions, offering insights about Japanese medical practices and asking detailed questions about American society and customs. The change was most evident during a conversation that took place in late July, when a newly arrived group of Japanese nurses expressed shock and dismay at seeing men and women eating together in the facility's dining hall. Yuki found herself defending American customs, explaining to her countrywomen that the casual interaction between genders did not represent moral corruption but rather a more efficient and humane way of organizing professional relationships. "I thought the same thing when I first arrived," she told the newcomers in Japanese, aware that Dr. Chen was listening to the conversation with obvious interest. "I was convinced that American women had lost their feminine virtue, that American men had abandoned their proper authority. But after watching them work together for weeks, I have begun to understand that they accomplish more through cooperation than we achieve through separation." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Yuki describing her observations of American medical teams where men and women collaborated as equals, where decisions were made based on professional expertise rather than gender hierarchy, where individual capability mattered more than traditional social roles. Her newfound ability to articulate these ideas, to defend them against skeptical questioning from her countrywomen, represented a profound shift in her understanding of herself and her capabilities. Dr. Chen recognized that Yuki was undergoing what she termed ideological reconstruction, a process where fundamental assumptions about society and human nature were being examined and modified in response to new experiences and information. This was not the result of coercion or propaganda, but rather the natural consequence of exposure to alternative models of social organization that proved to be more effective and humane than traditional Japanese customs. The intelligence value of this transformation extended far beyond individual psychology. As Yuki and other female prisoners began to articulate their changing perspectives on gender roles, social hierarchy, and political authority, they provided American analysts with crucial insights into the mindset of educated Japanese women who might play important roles in post-war reconstruction efforts. Their accounts of conditions in Japanese medical facilities revealed the extent to which the war had degraded essential services, while their reactions to American abundance provided clear evidence that Japanese civilian morale was far more fragile than official propaganda suggested. Most importantly, their evolving attitudes toward gender equality and democratic social organization indicated that Japanese society might be more receptive to fundamental reforms than American policymakers had previously believed. The communal table had become a symbol of democratic values in action, demonstrating through daily practice that cooperation between equals produced better results than hierarchical authority based on traditional social roles. The women who shared those meals would carry these lessons back to Japan, where they would contribute to the social and political transformations that would reshape Japanese society during the American occupation and beyond. As August 1945 approached, bringing with it the atomic bombings, Soviet entry into the war, and Japan's eventual surrender, the female prisoners who had experienced American abundance and democratic social customs would find themselves uniquely positioned to understand the magnitude of the changes that lay ahead. They had seen firsthand that alternative models of social organization were not only possible but more effective than traditional Japanese customs, and they possessed the intellectual framework necessary to participate constructively in the reconstruction of their devastated homeland. The taste of real butter had been shocking enough, but the flavor of equality, the possibility that human relationships could be based on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy, would prove to be the more lasting and transformative experience. The communal table had offered them a glimpse of what their society could become, and that vision would sustain them through the difficult years of reconstruction that lay ahead. In her final report before the facility was closed and its prisoners repatriated, Dr. Chen wrote, "The transformation we have witnessed in these women represents one of the most hopeful developments of this terrible war. They have discovered that human dignity and social progress are not incompatible with feminine virtue, that cooperation between equals produces better results than hierarchical authority, and that individual capability matters more than traditional social roles. When these women return to Japan, they will carry with them the seeds of democratic transformation that may prove more valuable than any military victory in ensuring lasting peace between our nations." The communal table had served its purpose, not as a tool of propaganda or coercion, but as a window into possibilities that had always existed but had been hidden by artificial constraints and traditional limitations. The Japanese women who had shared those meals would spend the rest of their lives working to transform their society, inspired by the memory of butter that was actually yellow, bread that was soft and white, and the revolutionary idea that men and women could eat together as equals. Yuki Tanaka returned to Japan in September 1945, carrying in her luggage a small notebook filled with observations about American medical practices, social customs, and democratic principles. But she carried in her memory something far more valuable: the knowledge that human relationships could be based on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy, that individual worth could be measured by capability rather than gender, and that the taste of freedom was sweeter than any meal she had ever eaten. The communal table had changed her life, but its influence would extend far beyond her personal transformation. In the decades that followed, as Japan struggled to rebuild itself from the ashes of total war, the women who had witnessed American abundance and democratic equality would play crucial roles in shaping their nation's future. They would become teachers, doctors, nurses, and eventually politicians, carrying with them the memory of a different way of organizing human society. The butter had been real, the bread had been soft, and the possibility of equality had been demonstrated through daily practice rather than abstract theory. These were the flavors that would season Japan's post-war transformation, contributing to the democratic reforms, women's rights movements, and social progress that would make their nation a beacon of peace and prosperity in the decades to come. The communal table had served more than food, it had served hope. And hope, once tasted, proved to be more nourishing than any meal, more lasting than any propaganda, and more powerful than any weapon in the arsenal of human transformation. In the end, the most profound victory was not achieved through superior firepower or industrial capacity, but through the simple act of sharing food as equals. The Japanese women who had laughed in disbelief at American chocolate had discovered something far more valuable than culinary abundance. They had discovered the taste of human dignity, served daily at a table where gender did not determine worth, where respect was offered freely, and where the future could be imagined in flavors they had never been allowed to sample. The meal was finished, but its memory would nourish them for the rest of their lives, and through them, it would feed a nation's hunger for transformation, equality, and peace.